Welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. And now, here's Chris McCann.
Good evening and welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Bible study in the book of Genesis. Tonight is study number 2 of Genesis chapter 33, and we're at the beginning of chapter 33 in verse 1. And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men, and he divided the children unto Leah, and unto Rachel, and unto the 2 handmaids, and he put the handmaids and their children foremost, and Leah and her children after, and Rachel and Joseph hindermost. And he passed over before them, and bowed himself to the ground 7 times, until he came near to his brother. And Esau ran to meet him, and embraced him, and fell on his neck, and kissed him, and they wept. And he lifted up his eyes, and saw the women and the children, and said, Who are those with thee? And he said, The children which God hath graciously given thy servant. And I'll stop reading there. All right, in our last study, we started looking at the 400 and seeing other places in the Bible where 400 men, 400 prophets, who would have been all men, were mentioned. And it took us to a few scriptures where we saw that references to 400 prophets had to do with false prophets. We saw, I think, 3 verses that indicated that. But then we started looking at David and his men, and David had 400 men, which grew to 600, and we saw 2 instances where David was going to battle, prepared to fight in one case, but never did fight, with Nabal. And in the second case, he did go to battle and fight with the Amalekites. And the 400 men went with him, while 200 men remained behind with the stuff. And we were looking at 1 Samuel chapter 30, and we're going to turn back there again. 1 Samuel chapter 30, and we read in verse 17, And David smote them from the twilight even unto the evening of the next day, and there escaped not a man of them, save 400 young men which rode upon camels and fled. And David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away, and David rescued his 2 wives. Now here we also see 400 young men that escaped and fled. So that's something else for us to consider as we're looking at this number. We haven't made it or drawn any conclusions yet. We're just going to the verses where 400 men are in view. And as I mentioned in the last study, David has gone to the battle with 400 men, but as we read the account, we read David smote them, David recovered all, David rescued his 2 wives, and a second time David recovered all, and David took all the flocks. This is David's spoil. David, 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 because he's a type of Christ, and Christ fights alone. This is a battle that identifies with God's salvation program, the deliverance of captives, the deliverance of David's wives, and all the elect are the bride of Christ, and the spoil taken. It all spiritually points to God's salvation program. And so David is the focus. He's the main character as far as God's concerned. David won the battle. And yet we know 400 men were with him, and they point this out when we continue to read in verse 21 of 1 Samuel 30. And David came to the 200 men, which were so faint that they could not follow David, whom they had made also to abide at the brook Besor, and they went forth to meet David, and to meet the people that were with him. And when David came near to the people, he saluted them. Then answered all the wicked men and men of Belial of those that went with David, and said, Because they went not with us, we will not give them aught of the spoil that we have recovered, save to every man his wife and his children, that they may lead them away and depart. Then said David, Ye shall not do so, my brethren, with that which Jehovah hath given us, who has preserved us and delivered the company that came against us into our hand. For who will hearken unto you in this matter? But as his part is that goeth down to the battle, so shall his part be that tarrieth by the stuff. They shall part alike. And it was so from that day forward, that he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel unto this day. The statute is that those that stay with the stuff will receive a like portion as those that went to the battle. But notice that, and we discussed how the total number of David's men is 600, and 400 is 2/3 that went to the battle, and 200 is 1/3 that stayed back and abode with the stuff. And there's a 2/3, 1/3 relationship that we have seen numerous times that spiritually identifies with God's salvation program, as we read in Zechariah 13, verses 8 and 9, that 2/3 are cut off and die, and 1/3 are said to be God's people, and they live, they survive, just like two captains and their 50s perished, burned up. One captain and his 50 survived. And we have another example with David himself. If we go over to 2 Samuel chapter 8, starting in verse 1, it says, And after this it came to pass that David smote the Philistines and subdued them. And David took Methgamah out of the hand of the Philistines, and he smote Moab and measured them with a line, casting them down to the ground. Even with 2 lines measured he to put to death, and with 1 full line to keep alive. And so the Moabites became David's servants and brought gifts. And once again, we see 2 parts die, 2 lines, 1 part lives. Very consistent theme. Only does it go off script, so to speak, in the New Testament, in Revelation chapter 8, when the 3rd part comes under judgment. But, we've talked about that, how the 3rd part is a figure of speech that the church is identified with, because the elect of God, who are likened to the 3rd part, were found in the churches and congregations. But anyway, that helps us to understand why David is the one solely in view with concerning that battle, and the 400 God doesn't mention, although they mention it. But notice how they're described again in 1 Samuel 30, verse 22, speaking of the 400 who would be the 2 parts, the 2/3 of David's men, or we could say 2/3 of Christians, as David's a type of Christ, and Christ's men are Christians. And of course, many are called, but few are chosen. But again, 1 Samuel 30, verse 22, Then answered all the wicked men and men of Belial of those that went with David. They went with him to the battle. Now, let's think on the spiritual level. On the spiritual level, what that battle represents, it is the battle of salvation, delivering the captives. And the Bible insists Christ does it alone. He does it alone. But these men went with David, and so they're spoken of as being wicked men, men of Belial, and they refuse to give a portion of the spoil to the ones who were left behind with the stuff. And those left behind, they are the third part that would identify with God's elect children. They didn't go to the battle. No, they were too faint. They were faint, and so they couldn't continue to the battle. And so I think we can clearly see the spiritual picture that these 400 who entered into the battle are like those attempting to do their own work in order to get themselves saved or to bring salvation to others. It's a works gospel, another kind of a gospel, just like the 400 prophets of the grove or the 400 prophets that spake with one voice to the king of Israel. Go up and prosper to Ramoth Gilead, O king. And they lied because the king went up and he died, as only Micaiah the prophet, the true prophet of God, foretold. And so here too, the 400 are likened to wicked men of Belial, and they do not want to share the spoil with the third part. In a way, I think we can understand this. Just think of the churches, and in the churches are many unsaved who have a works gospel, free will gospel. Even if they call it reform, they add that touch of works to it, that yes, we're saved by election, but you have to believe. That's how they teach you in reform seminaries. You believe like a Calvinist, but you teach like an Arminian. And no wonder there's so much confusion in the churches. And so they're saying you have to go to the battle. You have to contribute. You have to do your part. You have to go with Christ and do your work of faith. And yet God's elect do not. God will not allow them to engage in that kind of thing. And so here we see that they're too faint. Now, historically, these men may be the weaker ones, and that doesn't matter. But we're told they're faint twice. If we go to 1 Samuel 30, verse 10, it says, "But David pursued, he and the 400 men, for 200 abode behind, which were so faint that they could not go over the brook Besor." And again in verse 21, "And David came to the 200 men, which were so faint that they could not follow David." They would have followed, but they were so faint. Now, the Hebrew word translated as "so faint" is Strong's number 6296, and it's only found in these two verses, used these two times. And so that doesn't help us. However, there's a related word, only one related word. It's 6297, and it has the identical consonants, but different vowel pointing. So it would be pronounced differently, but remember, the vowels were added at a later time. They're not inspired. It's the consonants that God wrote in the Hebrew. And when we look up 6297, we find this. Let's go to 2 Kings 19, verse 35. And it says, "And it came to pass that night that the angel of Jehovah went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses." The word corpses is this word 6297. Also in 2 Chronicles 20, which we're very familiar with. It's that chapter. It's a historical parable pointing to Judgment Day. And it says in 2 Chronicles 20, verses 24 and 25, And when Judah came toward the watchtower in the wilderness, they looked unto the multitude, and behold, they were dead bodies fallen to the earth, and none escaped. The dead bodies is this same Hebrew word, and it's translated that way again in verse 25. And when Jehoshaphat and his people came to take away the spoil of them, they found among them in abundance both riches with the dead bodies and precious jewels, which they stripped off for themselves more than they could carry away. And there were 3 days, and gathering of the spoil was so much. So the dead bodies, the corpses, and it's used several more times consistently in this manner. Isaiah 34:3 will be the last verse I read, but you can look up the word. That's why I'm giving the number, and why I often give the number, so you can look it up. Isaiah 34 verse 3, another chapter dealing with Judgment Day. Their slain shall also be cast out, and their stink shall come up out of their carcasses, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood. The word carcasses is the word translated as corpses, dead bodies, carcasses. I think we get the meaning of this word very well. It means you're dead. You're dead. And even there in Isaiah, the stink came up out of their carcasses, which reminds us of what was said of Lazarus in John chapter 11. In John 11, verse 39, we read, Jesus said, "Take ye away the stone." Martha, the sister of him that was dead, saith unto him, Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he has been dead 4 days. He stinketh. He's a dead corpse. And you see, I think we can see the relationship and why God used this word of the 200 that remained behind by the stuff, because they were so faint they could not follow David. That is, they were dead in trespasses and sins. They were like Lazarus, a dead, stinking corpse, and they could not do anything to win their salvation, to deliver themselves, to free them from the spiritual dead condition they were in. Only the Lord Jesus Christ could accomplish that. And so we see this beautiful spiritual picture develop with the 200, maybe not the best soldiers, maybe not the ones you would want so much if you were fighting a physical war. They're exhausted and they have to stay with the stuff. But in the spiritual battle that God fights for his people, exactly the ones that you want. You don't want the 400. The 400 who think they're alive and have strength and they can fight. They can do work necessary to obtain deliverance and set captives free. No, it's the opposite. As far as spiritual battles go and physical battles, you look for the broken ones, the defeated ones, the ones who recognize that they're dead in sin, and the only way they can live is for Christ to do a miracle, for God to have mercy upon them. And so they tarried behind with the stuff. And by the way, the word stuff is the same word as vessel or vessels, and we won't go there, but in Jeremiah 18, where the potter takes the vessel and makes the pottery. And so stuff and vessel are the same Hebrew word, just like in the New Testament, where we read, let him on the housetop not go down to take his stuff away. And that word stuff is also translated as vessels in Romans 9, where God speaks of vessels unto honor and unto dishonor. He's the potter. It's really picking up the imagery from Jeremiah 18. And there it clearly identifies the vessels of honor with the elect children of God. And so the 200 who are so faint, the fact that they're faint identifies with those that are not willing or able to do any work and have come to recognize that fact. And so they wait for David. Let David go. Let him go win the battle and return to us. And David does. And they partake of the spoil. They are given equal portion. Well, okay, so we've looked at 400 in a few different places in the Bible, and we see, I think, pretty much consistently that when we read of 400 men, 400 prophets, that it identifies with those that are under the law. They're under the law. False prophets are ungodly men, and therefore still in their sin, still in a marriage relationship to the law of God. They've not become dead to the law in order to be married to another, as only those saved by the Lord Jesus. And so Esau is a type and figure of the law in this account. Remember, he identifies with Mount Seir, and God a couple of times relates Mount Seir to Sinai or to Mount Horeb, where the law was given. And so Esau is coming. He's coming with those that are under the law, and they're a serious threat, a serious danger. And this is why Jacob has sent the offering before him, the gifts, the present, and so forth. Well, let's go back to Genesis 33, and we read in verse 1 again, and Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men, and he divided the children unto Leah, and unto Rachel, and unto the 2 handmaids. And he put the handmaids and their children foremost, and Leah and her children after, and Rachel and Joseph hindermost. Now, we don't readily see this, but the number 3 is really in view here, starting with the first sentence. And Jacob lifted up his eyes, so you have eyes, and looked, that would be the second thing, and behold. So eyes, looked, behold, a threefold emphasis on seeing. Then Esau came with the 400, and he, Jacob, divided the children to Leah, Rachel, and the 2 handmaids into 3 groups, and different numbers in each group, as we're told in verse 2, and he put the handmaids and their children foremost. That'd be 2 handmaids, 4 children, 2 each. They're the first group. And Leah and her children after. So Leah and 6 sons plus Dinah. So Leah and 7 children. The emphasis could be on the 6 or on 7. And Rachel and Joseph hindermost. So again, with verse 2, 3 groups. 3 groups are in view. And if we add up the wives and the children, not Dinah, not the daughters, we find the handmaids and their children would be 6. Leah and her children, the 6 sons, would be 7, so that's 13. And then Rachel and Joseph, hindermost, 13 plus 2, 15. And 15 is 3 times 5. And so again, the number 3, the purpose of God, 5 having to do with atonement. And we already know that this scene does have to do with the atonement, because if we go back to Genesis 32, verse 20, it says, "And say ye moreover, Behold, thy servant Jacob is behind us, for he said, I will appease him with the present that goeth before me, and afterward I will see his face. Peradventure he will accept of me." And if you remember, the Hebrew word translated appease is the word for atonement. It's the usual word for atonement in the Old Testament, and the word present is translated as offering. And so Jacob has made an offering to Esau in order to appease him, to atone to him. And this would be historically for the deceiving nature of when he obtained the blessing. But spiritually, it's a different matter. Spiritually, you see, if Esau identifies with the law, and he must, and actually Jacob will make a reference to Esau and say, in seeing Esau's face, it's as though I've seen the face of God. So there's no mistaking this with the language of bowing down and the language of finding grace in his sight. Esau is representing the law of God, and the law of God has the weight of God. So it's as though God himself is coming, and it's the purpose of God for this meeting, this encounter to take place, and for the atonement to be received, and the experience of Jacob finally meeting Esau after 40 years could go either way. Before we would read this, it could be Esau comes to smite, to kill and destroy Jacob, his wives, and his children, and just take away all of his flocks. It could have gone that way, but it didn't. It didn't. So the presents sent before to appease were accepted. They were received in a positive manner, and so we read in verse 3, and this again is referring to Jacob, and he passed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother, and Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Well, we have a lot of material here, a lot of things to look at concerning this long-awaited meeting between twin brothers that has finally happened historically and actually points to something happening at the end of the world, at the end of time, in our day. And so, Lord willing, we'll continue looking at this interesting account when we get together with our next Bible study.
Thank you for joining us for eBible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies and information, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. Until our next Bible study, may the Lord's perfect will be done.